Slaying lots of babies at a time of the birth of another important person. Sound familiar? Sure. This is exactly what happened with Moses. The problem here, just like the Moses story, is that no historian records the mass murder of infants and toddlers at this time. This is not something that would go unnoticed by historians.
This event was also spoken by a non-Christian writer named Ambrosius Macrobius, who around 430 AD wrote the following in his work Saturnalia. Volume 2 Chapter 4:11. When he, Emperor Augustus, heard that among the boys in Syria under 2 years old whom Herod, king of the Jews, had ordered to kill, his own son was also killed, he said, "It is better to be Herod's pig than a son." Note: Syria, at this time, was known as the area between Asia Minor and Egypt, which included Syria, Lebanon and the land of Israel.
But notice the very last sentence. Notice that Matthew is invoking the Old Testament again, and he's saying that it was foretold that Jesus would be a Nazarene. The problem is that there's no such prophecy in the Old Testament. Nazareth, a village, is completely unknown and never referred to in the Old Testament. This should cause the religious to second-guess the whole thing, but it doesn't. In an annotation to the King James Version, there is a reference to Judges 13:5. "For lo, thou shalt conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come on his head. For the child shall be a Nazarite unto God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." Two major problems here. First, this passage has nothing to do with the Messiah, but instead a prophecy to a barren woman telling her that she's going to become the mother of Samson. Second, Matthew mistranslates Nazarite. A Nazarite is not someone from Nazareth, but instead refers to someone who takes an ascetic or a lifestyle vow, where the person will refrain from cutting his hair, avoid alcohol, avoid corpses and graves. Basically, it's an old dirty-ass hippie. Jesus may have been a hippie, but he wasn't a Nazarite. Obviously didn't avoid alcohol, and he was manhandling dead bodies and raising the dead all the time. So it's 100%, even to a biblical literalist, that this prophecy was misread. Because it's obvious that these writers spend so much time making sure that prophecy comes true, an intellectually honest person will say that the authors who decided to actually attempt to refer to prophecy get it wrong several times, and therefore they're probably making it up.
Even though the words Nazi right and Nazareth look and sound similar in English, they are unrelated in Hebrew. Here is a classic example for reasons to study the scriptures instead of just reading them. Just reading it you might get something erroneous like what this individual complains. But when one studies this particular verse, they will notice that the single verse is actually speaking of two things. First of all, the Greek language did not have quotation marks. Therefore, our modern translations are misleading when they show quotes in the text. Matthew did not have a direct quotation in mind. Second, Matthew does not say prophet, singular. He says prophets, plural. We should therefore not expect to find a single, specific prophecy, but rather a group to that effect. In the Palestine of Jesus' time, the whole region of Galilee and its inhabitants, and in particular Nazareth, were looked upon in a very negative way by other Israelites. Perhaps because Galilee had often been occupied by pagan nations during Israel's history. Examples being Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and Hiram, king of Tyre. There is ample scriptural evidence to support the conclusion that Galilee and Nazareth were looked down on, even despised. This is why it says in John 1:46,
Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. Come and see, said Philip.
Matthew here was referring to several Old Testament references to the despised character of Jesus.
But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. When I weep and fast, I must endure scorn. This is what the Lord says, the Redeemer and Holy One of Israel, to him who was despised and abhorred by the nation, to the servant of rulers. Kings will see you and stand up. Princes will see and bow down, because of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
So, it would be a reference not to an actual location but the malign character of the Messiah. Even as Nazareth was maligned for housing the Roman garrison, Matthew was using it in reference to the implied hatred of Christ. The word Nazarene in Jesus' time, while still literally referring to someone from Nazareth, had become more or less a synonym for despised. The Israelites were convinced that no prophet could originate in that lowly place, although Jesus in fact only grew up there, and was born in Bethlehem, the town from which the Messiah was to come. These facts, and the many messianic prophecies concerning the rejection of the Messiah by the people of his day, led Matthew to use general terms following the example of Jesus. In referring to the effect of the prophecies, that the Messiah would be rejected and held in contempt, the verse could be paraphrased, for the purpose of this discussion, in the following way. He went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So is fulfilled with what was said through the prophets. He will be despised and referred to contemptuously. Which, far from contradicting or undermining the authority and authenticity of the biblical scriptures, is in fact a demonstration that God is faithful to the words he gives to his prophets. Another thing to be noticed here is a play on words. Matthew was referring to the Old Testament symbol of the branch in Isaiah 11. For instance, in Isaiah 11:1 we read, "Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch, Hebrew Natzir, from his roots will bear fruit." The Hebrew word Natzir is the word from which we get the modern name Nazareth. The symbol of the branch is stressed by multiple prophets in the rest of the Old Testament, while the Hebrew word was not always Natzir. As in Isaiah 11:1, the other prophets refer to the Messiah as the branch, Hebrew Semach. Jeremiah writes,
The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land. In those days and at that time I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land.
Of course, David was a type of the Messiah, that the Jews were expecting to come and sit eternally on his messianic throne. Zechariah writes,
Listen, High Priest Joshua, you and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant, the branch. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here is the man whose name is the branch, and he will branch out from his place and build the temple of the Lord.
Here, the priesthood and the kingly line is intertwined. The priesthood under Joshua was a symbol of the Messiah, who was to come. Jesus was both a king and a priest. In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. It is clear that Matthew did not introduce a contradiction in the text.